So here's the story. It's called Aria. She'd worked in the warehouse for a year before he started to notice her. Generally, she tried hard not to be noticed. So when he started texting her, she wasn't flattered as much as she was uneasy. Her mother had died a month before, right as the roads began to get icy on their dead-end street. Now it took everything in Aria's power to get up each day, to go to the job she still somehow managed to go to, keeping the lights on at home and the bills paid, even when the paycheck itself was insultingly low. She'd started to subsist on discounted oatmeal packets and apples she'd picked at an orchard out past the county line. Usually, she would quickly eat breakfast, then cry in her car before she had to go into the warehouse, putting on her headphones as a kind of armor to keep the men from constantly chatting her up as she assembled boxes on the line. But he wasn't on the line with her. He was the boss's son. He sat in an office in the corner, a sheet of glass separating them. He didn't seem to do much work there, as far as she could see. But she wasn't interested in talking to him for any reason. The necessity of the job made it so she had to be polite. So she would nod and smile and take her headphones off if he ever stopped by to talk to the crew on the line. When he texted her one day, she didn't know who it was, and so she replied in quick, one-word responses until he revealed it was him. Then she dropped her phone in one of the boxes. She wasn't supposed to have it out on the line, and when she had to scramble to get it, he teasingly tapped the glass of the window and smiled at her. She didn't think it was funny, but she winced back good-naturedly. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Aria's mother had once had a dream for Aria to study music, and while Aria had a nice singing voice, it was more attuned to sad songs that played on dive bar jukeboxes than it was to singing expansive, dramatic solos sung in Italian, as her name would suggest. Her favorite opera was La Bohème. To be honest, it was the only one she'd ever seen live, due to one of those take poor public school kids to see a performance type of programs. She loved it because of the first scene. A writer, a philosopher, and a musician, all standing around trying to get warm from the makeshift fire, while trying to troubleshoot just how they were going to pay the rent. She never asked him why he was texting her. She felt sad and lonely, and even though she knew it wasn't a good idea, it was probably one of the worst ideas. She felt she wasn't in a space to ignore or protest, so she rationalized texting back as somehow keeping things together. But still, she felt herself falling into something she couldn't explain, and she wasn't sure if it was exciting or terrifying. Don't be stupid, she told herself, so she tried to keep the text civil and cool, distant. Yes, I like working here. Yes, I love music. That's why I wear the headphones. Please thank your dad for letting us do that. He'd replied that he rarely thanked his dad for anything because he didn't want to be here. He wanted to leave Ohio for New York, but his dad said he wasn't going to pay for that nonsense, and so here he was wasting his days, and then after a week of this back and forth, he finally asked, "So, do you want to go to dinner?" The truth is, Aria had started to fantasize about the possibility of a warm, big meal at a cozy restaurant, and figured she could walk away at any time, so what's the harm? And the next thing you know, he was picking her up in a Land Rover that had been his dad's, but he'd rebuilt it and restored it. She knew he was older than her, but not by how many years, and she wondered if he thought that her youth and vulnerability made her easy to pluck off the line like one of the shinier apples she had strained to reach at the orchard. She was smarter than this, yet here she was, hoping for a nice meal and a glass of wine and an awkward kiss on the cheek before she could run into her mother's now empty house and fall asleep in her own bed. But who was she kidding? She ended up at his place. an impressive mid-century modern house near a man-made lake, much like the places her former classmates had lived in since she'd been bused to a nice suburban high school for a chance at college. A year after her graduation, life as she dreamt it was changed forever by her mother's death, and houses like this felt farther and farther away from any reality she could ever know. So there was the factory and the crying in the car, and now she was drinking glasses and glasses of wine she couldn't imagine being able to afford in this strange man's house, and all she knew about him was he liked some of the same kind of music. Every crime show she had ever watched flashed back at her, and she started to rub the sides of his deck chair that she sat in, almost compulsively, as if she were leaving her fingerprints on it. I was here, she wanted her DNA to say, just in case. She was troubled by how untroubled she was at every increasingly troubling possibility. The more wine she drank, the more she talked, and the more she told him. She got buzzed and started singing her mother's favorite song, Mercedes-Benz by Janis Joplin, remembering how funny they thought it was, how they tried to sound just like her when they sang it. That's a sad song, really, he said, and he relit the fire on the rocks of his modernist fire pit. She was a sad woman. I watched a documentary about her. Aria began to feel herself leave her body, like she was hovering above it, and looking down as she leaned into him against her better judgment. She kissed him, open on the mouth, and the next thing she knew, he'd extinguished the fire pit, and they were inside the house, rolling around on the beige carpet. Why do people with money love beige so much? She thought. He scrambled to unhook her bra. The next day at work was awkward. She had a horrible headache from the wine and struggled to keep up with her daily quota on the line. She'd long suspected most of her coworkers outperformed her, not only because most of them were big, muscly men in their 20s, but also because most, if not all of them, were regularly hopped up on some form of speed. Regardless, she was embarrassed to be hungover and even slower than usual. She kept thinking about his hands on her, hungry and warm, and she would look over in the direction of his office periodically, but he wasn't there. Her phone had ceased its buzzing. She sighed and felt shame well up in her body, starting in her stomach like a quick drop on a high roller coaster. He didn't show up that day, or the next, and the crying in her car in the morning turned into full-blown sad sing-alongs to Janice's Me and Bobby McGee, while she thought about how much she missed her mother. Over the weekend, she stopped herself from texting and decided to sleep the long sleep of the sad instead. By Sunday evening, she felt herself wishing that she actually believed in God. On Monday, he returned, walking in with a tall, regal blonde woman who appeared to be his girlfriend. He had never told Aria anything about a girlfriend. This one wore a shiny gold watch that looked like it could fund a semester of college. She seemed a bit older than him, and when Aria looked up at both of them, the woman touched him on the shoulder as if to telegraph to the whole warehouse that he belonged to her. He never once looked up to meet Aria's gaze, not that day or the next. The woman started popping in almost every day after that to take him to lunch or meet up with him at the end of the day. Aria began blasting loud metal and hip-hop on her headphones every day to the point that people got tired of telling her to turn her music down, and her supervisor warned her he'd write her up. She really wanted to quit, but she knew that would be stupider than sleeping with the boss's son. All she knew was that her compass for keeping anything stupid out of her life had obviously become broken. What she was more afraid of was becoming broken herself. She felt too close to that for comfort. It was a Friday morning when she heard him yelling at her boss, his father, the sound muffled behind the glass. "We're going to New York. You can sell that stupid house for all I care. I never wanted it anyway." She turned up the music on her headphones to drown out whatever came next. She figured it would just make her feel worse. She wanted to pretend she was anywhere that wasn't Ohio or New York or any other place where she'd have to continually fill boxes on a line with products she herself couldn't afford. She was tired of pretending that any of this was easier than it was. Maybe he thought she was too easy, but the truth was nothing in the world had ever felt easy for her. He never asked her how anything actually felt for her. The screaming of a band from Iceland filled her headphones. She wondered how many factories Iceland had. That night, she found herself laying on her stomach against the cold Ohio ground, and she thought about how she might have ended up under it that night when she had impulsively gone home with him. He had been a stranger then, and in most ways he was a stranger still. Now she was the one observing things as she saw them walk across the driveway, as if they were beyond her across some invisible line. She moved out of sight under a tree when he and the blonde started talking and laughing as they ducked into the vintage Land Rover she remembered once riding in. They disappeared down the road. She was surprised when the accelerant seemed to work even more quickly than she had observed on that online video, and by the time the fire had spread past the fire pit onto the side of the house, she found herself starting to sing to herself lines from that song Sinatra had made famous, these little town blues. They've all melted away. When she got to her car, she saw a huge cloud of smoke taking shape above her. She coughed and coughed until she got the door shut and put the car in reverse. Her hands instinctively guided her shaking body back to her mother's house. But when she got there, she couldn't seem to make herself go inside. So she sharply turned the car around, driving out onto the highway. The road seemed endless and open and welcoming as the sudden darkness of night descended. Thanks.